Welcome back all again. Dr. JC here. Week 10. Wow, week 10. Going fast. Stay alert, stay alive, right? We're going to take this lecture in two parts. The first part, this lecture, we're going to look at this Reconquista, what that means, and the Crusades. Now, we're not going to fight all the Crusades. Too many to be sure, but we will look at the opening few Crusades and posit some different notions on what the Crusade and crusading meant, both to the West in Western Europe and in the Near East in the Islamic or Muslim world, all right? And then in the second lecture or next part, we'll talk about the growth and power of the Bishop of Rome or the Catholic Church, this Pope, and how papal power under an individual by the name of Innocent III over about 400 years will eventually give way to powerful kings. Therefore, as mentioned previously, just as individuals throughout this feudal world were vying to be named Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, all civil leaders looking to the Pope for leadership. At the end of this 400-year reign or period, so basically from the thousands to about 1400, by the time we get to 1400, no longer will individuals be looking for the Pope to grant them authority. Individual kings will have claimed absolute divine right themselves. So we'll see that emerge over the course of the next two lectures. So let's focus specifically now on the Crusades and this Reconquista, and then in the next lecture we'll move on to papal power, the rise and decline of papal power. Prior to getting into the Crusades themselves, I want to talk about this Reconquista or reconquest of Spain, because in some ways it in and of itself really was the beginnings of these Crusades. At roughly about the same time as this Battle of Tours that we talked about previously. That Battle of Tours is where Abdul Rahman el-Ghafiqi led Islamic forces against Charles the Hammer Martel, and Abdul Rahman was defeated, run from the field, himself killed as we mentioned, and those forces retreated across the Pyrenees Mountains, which separate France from Spain, into Spain. Thus what this Reconquista was is the idea in the West, the idea of the Catholic Church, that Bishop of Rome, that Muslim forces should be thrown off the continent altogether and pushed off this Iberian Peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula being Spain and Portugal today. So the Reconquista is just that, the reconquest of Spain. The reconquest of Spain is not something that's going to happen overnight. As you can see on the map here, it's going to take about 700 years, all right? This is not quick change. That said, things were moving along fairly well for Christian forces. Over the first 300 years or so, Christian forces in waves and varying times would come in, assault, push Muslim forces further south, so that by the time we get to the call for these actual crusades, where Christians are going to quit focusing specifically on the Iberian Peninsula and start to focus on reconquering the Holy Land, or Jerusalem, they have recaptured half of the Iberian Peninsula. And in some ways, the time that it's taken to do this does indicate the level and strength and buy-in of the people of Islamic forces and culture that existed there. So from a Christian perspective, or perhaps even an Islamic perspective, this Reconquista or reconquest of Spain by Christian forces was truly a work in progress. It's going to take them over 700 years. While most scholars today consider the Reconquista an aspect or component of these Crusades, I want to take a minute now as we begin to consider these Crusades. First and foremost, what the devil were they? The word crusade comes from cruce segnate, meaning those signed by the cross. This was a description, especially after the 1100s, that was occasionally applied to the Crusaders themselves. The more modern use of the term tends to be entirely pejorative, very divisive. In this sort of post-enlightened, post-structuralist, post-modern world we exist, the idea of doing religious war seems odious at best, right? Or perhaps not so odious in the sense that we still see today warfare used as the main tool, the hammer, for different spiritual groups and faiths. Either way, the term crusade, from what it was originally intended to apply to or define, has evolved over time, and we're going to talk a little bit about the reasons why that has happened next. Prior to getting into this important battle of Manzikert here, the fight between Christian forces under the Byzantine Empire and Islamic forces, the Seljuk Turks, I want to make quick mention here of something that's really important regarding the Crusades as a whole. Yes, there's going to be fighting between Christians and Muslims here, to be sure. But there's also going to be fighting between Muslims, between Christians, and Christians even targeting Jews. We'll talk about this. Yes, this is spiritual warfare, but at the end of the day, it's really about power, whether it's Christian or Muslim. This is about power, and that story starts here at Manzikert. In the middle decades of the beginning of the 11th century, while Western Christians were focused on the Reconquista, Eastern Christians under the Byzantine Empire were facing severe threats from Muslim invaders, most specifically the Seljuk Turks. The Seljuks were a tribe from Central Asia. They had adopted Sunni Islam, and for many years they had been under the employ, really mercenaries, fighting for Islamic rulers. Yet once the Abbasid dynasty began to fall into decline in some sense, the Seljuks found themselves in this nice gray area whereby they could come to power themselves. And over time they would conquer what is today Iraq and Iran, and then they set their sights on the Byzantine Empire. On the 26th of August 1071, Byzantine forces under Romanos, after having some initial success early in the day, met with confusion near nightfall and ultimately destruction at the hands of Arslan and the Seljuk Turks. And while it would take several years for the Seljuk Turks to begin to conquer much of Anatolia, or what is modern-day Turkey, by the time we get to 1095, the new Byzantine Emperor Alexius I realizes he needs to call for help. That call for help will be received in Rome, and in some ways this is the exact answer to the Pope's prayers. For years, the bishops of Rome had looked for ways to unite these folks in Western Europe. Recall that this is still part of the Middle Ages, feudalism, where different individuals throughout Western Europe are at odds with one another. Different nobles fighting for regional control. Now all of a sudden the Pope can do what? Potentially unite all these people. These peoples had already been fighting Islam as part of this Reconquista. But it had always been done in sort of fits and starts. In other words, it wasn't really some sort of concerted effort or focus. That changes now. If the Holy Land is in threat, if Jerusalem is in threat, if the Eastern Christian Church is in threat, and if you really want to endear yourself to me to the point where I'm going to appoint you Holy Roman Emperor, then the best way for you to go ahead and show your status, show your merit, show your quality is to go march into those lands and defeat the Islamic forces in their own backyard. Encouraged at the prospects of Byzantine decline, helping Western expansion and growth again, the Pope issues the call across Europe, urging leaders to take up the cross, take up the sword, and march on Islam. Yet for all the party hats, balloons, and pom-poms in the world, it didn't help. The Pope's message kind of fell flat. Lots of leaders across Europe said, yeah, this is a good idea to be sure, but if I march my army out of my land and go all the way to the Middle East, who's going to defend what's back here? Someone's going to take it. And as a result, most of the high-ranking lords and nobles are going to balk here. Kind of embarrassing for the Pope in a way. While the so-styled princes across Europe may not have answered the call en masse, the people did. And on August 15th, 1096, the date set by Pope Urban II as departure date, the People's Crusade, or the first part of this first crusade, will begin. Driven to answer the call to crusade by charismatic individuals like Peter the Hermit. For those interested, I'd ask that you research him more. Interesting story here. This army then moves across Europe towards Constantinople. And I'm going to use the word army here very loosely because the vast majority of these individuals were from the lower ranks of European society, armed with the most crude of weapons, followed by not only camp followers, you can look that up, ladies of the evening, right? But women and children too. One can only imagine what the Byzantine Emperor was thinking when this mob came into Constantinople. Oh, good heavens, thank you. Rather than send an army of trained military professionals, you send me the poor. Thank you very much. Oh my. Some of these individuals, nonetheless, will cross the Bosporus, they will go fight the Seljuk Turks, and as you may imagine, it's an unmitigated disaster. They will be easily defeated. Yet in an odd way, this disorganized disaster that was this People's Crusade, or the first part of the crusade, actually there were some silver linings here. When news reaches the higher-ranking order of society in Western Europe about the embarrassment that was this first crusade, or at least the first part of it, as we'll see. They will answer the call, they being the princes themselves. Before we get into the Prince's Crusade here, or the second half of this first crusade, I want to talk about the other aspect or silver lining as it related to the disaster that was the first part of the crusade. Not only had the Seljuk Turks pushed the Byzantine Christians around for years, the first time they're up to bat against these Western Christians, they take them behind the woodshed and smack them around as well. Thus, the collective psychological mindset of Seljuk Turks as it relates to Christians was what? They're wimps. We kill them every time. And as a result of that, they let their guard down. That's going to be a problem. As Sun Tzu would say, know thy enemy, know thyself, and in 100 battles you'll never be in peril. If you thought all Christians were going to be like those in the first part of the People's Crusade, you guessed wrong, bro, and you're going to suffer for it. As one might expect, and as this map on this slide shows clearly, when this professional Western army shows up, these Christians are going to do some damage on the Seljuk Turks. They will hand them defeat after defeat, and former Muslim lands will be turned into Christian lands, Christian city-states, and even Jerusalem itself will be under siege. He who laughs last, and in this case, at the close of this first crusade, the princes will have done their job, and Christian forces are the ones that are going to hold most of the Muslim lands. Yet for Christian forces, they may have met with too much success here. Beyond the problems of supply, how do you resupply all these Christian city-states in places like Lebanon and Palestine today? The logistics of that are problematic. The other side of it, you will notice that these were established Latin kingdoms, meaning the Western Christian Church was claiming victory here, not the Byzantines. Therefore, if you are Western Christians, it's all the more problematic for you to supply these Christian city-states, is it not? It's going to prove to be too problematic. And just as the Western Europeans were embarrassed by the way the first half of the First Crusade went, Seljuk Turks too are going to be embarrassed here. Not only at how they performed in battle, but now you have these people living in your lands. This can't be. And as a result of that, we're going to see the rise of Islamic leaders looking to not only retake these lands, but rise to power themselves in the process. What's going to delay a response from Islam here, however, is the division in Islam. Not only are there political differences, most of these areas are still governed by city-states. Thus, power is local, not even regional. But there's differences in orthodoxy as well. Baghdad and Aleppo, Sunni. Cairo, Shia. So there's differences here in Islam that are going to impact the ability of Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, to make a concerted push and effort to drive Christian forces out. The divisions within will make it harder to do so. Interestingly enough, the divisions we see here in Islam are the same differences we're going to see in Christianity. While they won't be doctrinal or denominational differences just yet, we haven't gotten to this thing called a Protestant Reformation yet. They will be differences in the jealousies of the leaders in the Christian crusading states. Each of these individuals jealous of one another, each of these individuals vying for the Pope's favor to win that title of Holy Roman Emperor. So both sides are going to experience a degree of division, and because of this division, it's going to allow for the other side to take advantage of that division. Representative of this division, I'd like you to look at the map on the left-hand side of this slide. Not only are there differences in Islam in the Fatimid and Seljuk empires, the prior Shia, the latter Sunni, there are also differences in the Christian world here. The Byzantine Empire or Eastern Christian Church, Greek Orthodox Church, and all these Western Christian city-states. Latin, Kingdom of Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa, and others. The divisions here are ever apparent. Because of the division, it's going to lead to an environment, call it a power vacuum if you will, where somebody's going to come to the forefront to unite one side or the other. And we're going to see that occur under Imad al-Din Zengi here. In the next part of this lecture, and there are going to be 3 parts here instead of 2. Apologize, I'm going to call an audible here, partly because I want to slow down a little bit. It's very important what we're talking about because it does have a direct correlation to what's going on today. We're going to take a look at the rise of Zengi, the reasons why he came to power, and include the Jews into this discussion. Dr. JC out, part 1.